In fact, in order to understand what articulation between science and theology is, we have in fact to oppose articulation to two positions, and namely concordism and discordism. What is concordism? Is in fact the position, in fact, which confuse epistemologically and maybe ontologically the levels of science and the level of theology. For example, we go without any mediation, without any transition from science to theology, and from theology to science. And we know that discordism is not satisfactory because it confuses immanence and transcendence, and the main risk of concordism is to confuse God and the world, and to confuse God action, for example, with a pure physical process. With respect to Christian theology of creation, of course, we cannot confuse God and its creation, God and the world, and we have to refuse this kind of concordism. But concordism is, first of all, a mistake, an epistemological mistake, because it confused some level of questions which cannot be put directly together. In fact, the opposite of the symmetrical position would be the discordism. Discordism is in fact a position consisting of isolating science from theology, something which looks like Stephen Jay Gould called the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria principle. Both magisteria has not to overlap. We have to distinguish, in fact, to be quiet, to have peace amongst community, scientific community, theological or religious community, and we have to separate radically. But discordism addresses many questions, because with respect to Christian theology of creation, in fact, God has a relation. In fact, the world is not God, but God has a relation, and this is the creation. This is the essence of creation. God maintain a relation with the world, and in fact, we cannot conceive God as purely separated from the world. And at our level, it would be maybe dangerous to separate completely, because it would mean that in fact theological problems have no root in the real world. In fact, if you do some radical separation between both domains, you could obtain, at the one hand, the world of science, explaining nature and so on, and the world of theology, explaining something about God and even about the world, but from the point of view of theology, of the religion and so on, and with two descriptions which are in fact maybe incoherent. No, this is a kind of intellectual schizophrenia, and in fact it breaks the unity of the thought. And for Christian theology, for example, it is very important that the theological discourse theology, it is very important that theology is rooted in some reality. It is not a fiction. It is something which is already a meaning at the level of the world, of human being, and so on. Christian theology is a theology of incarnation, if you want to use these theological words. Then discordism is maybe also dangerous for the society, because if we isolate completely science is evolving according to pure internal criteria, but this can be bad for the society, because in fact if science produces some application which in fact impose some constraint to the environment, to the population, to the society, it's important that science debates with politicians, with philosophers, and even with theologians and religious responsible leaders and so on. Then, in fact, discordism has to be refused, not only because, from the point of view of Christian theology of creation, it would be not so good to isolate God and the world, but also because in fact at the level of the society, science cannot evolve only according its own curiosity, its own impulse. In fact, because many scientific products has in fact some important and impact for the society. Okay, then if we have to avoid concordism and discordism, we have to think about a solution, which in fact is what the Belgian philosopher Jean Ladrière called articulation between science and theology. And what it is, in fact, to articulate is to link, but without fusion, without confusion, and to distinguish without radical separation. In fact, articulation, the aim of articulation is in fact to initiate a dialogue, in fact, with a mediating place, if you want. If you consider that science and theology without any mediation, then you have the risk of confusion or separation. But you can think about a way to construct a mediation in between science and theology. And what is this mediation, which in fact realizes the articulation? This mediation is philosophy. Why? Because in fact science produces many questions, but for example, if science produces ethical questions, science cannot answer methodologically this question, because science is not able to assess completely action on an ethical point of view. Science produces necessarily ethical question, but it cannot solve this question on its own field. And in fact, another example, science describes and in fact gives us marvelous description of universe, of mathematics, of life, of human being, and so on. But science cannot solve the problem of the deep meaning of all these. What is the deep meaning of life, for example? And in fact, science generates many metaphysical and ethical questions, but science cannot solve this question. But philosophy is in fact the good place to address and to analyze such questions. And in fact, philosophy is naturally connected to science, because philosophy collects all these questions, important questions, which are not solved at the methodological level of natural and formal sciences. And philosophy can elaborate some solution to this question, can in fact analyze methodically this question and so on, can find the meaning of the concepts and so on. But in fact, philosophy is in fact a collection of many solutions. But what are in fact the solution which correspond to this, to our universe, to the human person, and so on? But philosophy let us alone, if you want. In fact, with philosophy we are facing a collection of possible solutions. And in fact, theology can shed some light to give some new intuitions to choose maybe a solution, to give some arguments to choose some solution in place of another. The religious traditions have also elaborate some answer to this fundamental question, and this tradition can shed new light on the solution proposed by philosophy. And naturally, this in fact theological information can enrich the philosophical debate. And you see that in fact we are now at the moment where science and theology can interact, but not immediately, but on the contrary, with a mediation. And this mediation is philosophy. But this mediation is not arbitrary, because in fact the questions coming from science are in fact naturally produced for science and has some philosophical flavor. Then in fact philosophy collects naturally this question generated by science, and there is a natural connection between philosophy and theology, because in fact on the basis, for example, of the revelation and tradition of the church, in fact all these fundamental questions are elaborated and can help the philosopher to solve or to clarify some these deep questions. Then there is a link, and in fact we are not going directly from science to theology. No, we are taking the time to elaborate this question philosophically, and this link is a way to put a relation between both, but it is also a way to avoid the confusion, the epistemological confusion of both. Then articulation is in fact this position saying that in fact we can link science and theology, but with the mediation of philosophy, which in fact introduce a rational in fact relation, but this this place of philosophy avoid to confuse both epistemological levels of science and theology. But now it is not maybe sufficient to say this. It is important also to say that the relation is not one-sided, if you want. We can also think about a theologian, which is, for example, reflecting about a theological or biblical content in the context of Christian theology, reflecting about theological or exegesis content, and address to the philosopher a question saying, well, in this theological or biblical content, there is something which is significant philosophically, and the philosopher can collect this meaning, and in fact, the philosopher can look in the science if there is something which corresponds to this question coming from theology. To be more concrete, for example, let us think about an essential point in Christian theology is the freedom which is let at the world by God. In Christian theology, the world is not God. Creation is ad extra. God is not the world, and the world has a real autonomy. And this autonomy is important because autonomy means a kind of freedom, and God wants to have God's think about the human person as a person endowed with freedom, and this freedom enables us to love God and to pray Him freely, and so on. It in fact is important for the relation between the person and God. This is a theological reflection around autonomy, around freedom, and so on. And in fact, the philosopher can collect, in fact, in philosophy, this question, and can elaborate the question of freedom and autonomy. For example, we can say philosophically, if there is some freedom, important freedom, okay, if there is some autonomy in the universe, then all the things are not necessary. Maybe some things are contingent. Not all the things are predetermined. And then the question of freedom at the level of theology is now the question of necessity and contingence. And the philosopher can look in science and ask his scientific or her scientific colleague in order to know if there is some kind of degree of freedom in the evolution of the universe, in life evolution, in the evolution towards human being, and so on. And the scientist can say yes or no. He say, for example, yes, there are some real degree of freedom in the universe, and in fact, the theologian, in fact, has produced some question starting from its own field, and in fact he looks towards science via the mediation of philosophy, freedom in theology, autonomy, necessity and contingence in philosophy, and degree of freedom in science, and we have some articulation in the reverse direction. And we have to conceive articulation as a kind of circle, a kind of hermeneutical circle, if you want. Science is searching its deep meaning, and this deep meaning is elaborating at the level of philosophy, and philosophy, in fact, profit of all this rich content of religious tradition of the Bible and so on, the exegesis and so on. And in the reverse direction, we can think about a theologian which is looking towards the science via the mediation of philosophy, and we have a cycle, if you want. And this cycle has to be conceived dynamically, because at every time science is changing, and at every time we are making, in fact, deep discovery about the meaning of God's word in the Bible. We are reflecting more and more deeply about the dogmatic content of theology and so on. And all these things are evolving. And we have a kind of dynamical circle. And in fact, we can ask the question, well, is this circle completely closed, if you want? Because you can just imagine that science produces some question, the philosopher elaborates this question, but in fact you don't find anything corresponding in theology. Or in the reverse direction, you can just imagine somebody who looks something in theology or in the Bible, and he extracts some philosophical question and try to find something corresponding or in resonance in science, and he do not find anything. For example, if we extract something concerning the creation, and if somebody is persuaded that the creation lasts 6 times 24 hours, okay, if you try to find something interesting in science corresponding to this, no, it does not work. Then the cycle is not obligatorily closed. In fact, to build this circle and to prove that this articulation exists and works dynamically is not a priori, is not a result which you get a priori. No, you have to prove that in fact there is such kind of rational articulation. Of course, this is not. This articulation is not exhaustive. This articulation is dynamical, but in fact, the task of the philosopher, but also the theologian, is to prove that this articulation is possible. It does not mean that in fact all is successful. No, but it means that a link, a dialogue, a debate is possible and is in fact based on some rational grounds. And in fact, I think, and it was the intuition of Jean Ladrillère, and this is nice intuition, that in fact this debate and this link can be built, and it is in fact interesting even theologically, because it proves that the science and theology cannot be confused, but can be linked by a dynamical mediation, and then the result is also to find this natural route on which the theological discourse is based. Theology cannot be reduced to a natural route, but in fact theology has some natural root, and this explains why it is not an artificial, arbitrary discourse, but has already, at the level of nature, a kind of pertinence. But of course, transcendence cannot be reduced to immanence, but immanence can be articulated with transcendence via this, and the reflection about this relation between immanence and transcendence, in fact, can be translated in the world of articulation. Then I think that articulation is a mode of dialogue between science and theology, which is very coherent with a theology of creation, because in fact creation is precisely for St. Thomas Aquinas a relation between God and the world, by which God set the world and sustained the world in His existence. Then the articulation is not only an epistemological good way to link theology and science, but is also a kind of rational approach which is really consonant with the theology of creation.